Good to see you. Thank you for being here tonight. Before we get started, does anyone have an update on Ray? Last I heard, Ray was out of surgery, successful surgery, doing pretty well in recovery, but I didn't hear beyond that. Has anyone heard anything beyond that you want to share? Okay, we'll just wait and see if we get a little more information about that. We're going to be back in Daniel chapter 11. I appreciate Brother Bailey kind of continuing what we did the previous week. He kind of filling in some gaps is what we're after. And tonight we're going to try to wrap up chapter 11. What I'd like for us to do before we offer the prayer and get into it is I want to tell you kind of where we're going to go and what we're going to try to accomplish here. I've wrestled with the best way to go through chapter 11, and at one point I was thinking we would just go by paragraphs or collections of verses and talk about the different kings that are mentioned, that are referenced, and the 6 Syrian wars and all of that. And the more I got into that and put things together on that, the more I thought that's just not really what we need to do. If you want a good history lesson about that time period, then you can get that. You can find that at Wikipedia. That's pretty accurate. You can find that. That's not really what we're going to do. We're going to kind of take chapter 11 in a little different way. So that's the plan. Now, would you join me in prayer as we begin, please? Heavenly Father, we're thankful for this time, and we're thankful, Father, for this church family. We're thankful for the love we have one for another, and we're thankful, Father, for all those who work to make it what it is. We are especially mindful this evening of Brother McMahon and the surgery that he had today, and his family and those doctors attending him. We ask your blessings on him and help us to reach out and encourage him and all those in our number who just have a tough time sometimes. Thank you so much for Jesus, in whom we have salvation and in whom we have forgiveness. Help us, Father, to clothe ourselves with humility. Help us to be kind to each other. Forgive us when we fail you. We all do. Thank you so much for loving us. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. So what we're going to do is a really, really short, quick reminder about where we were. So in chapter 11, verse 4 is key, because verse 4 gets us to a fixed, known point in time or person in time, and that is Alexander the Great. when we get to Alexander the Great, then we know about what time frame we're dealing with. Now, the reason it's important to keep Alexander the Great in mind in chapter 11 is because he kind of centers you about the time period we're talking about. Some people get way out of whack with chapter 11, and what it's really about, most of it, the very end and then chapter 12 a little different, but most of it is about the time between the Testaments. It is about what's going to happen in the short term, the next couple, 300-400 years with God's people. That's the emphasis. And so remembering Alexander the Great with chapter 11 kind of puts you right in that time frame. And so it's a good way to remind yourself of what's going on. Remember, you have the prophecy here, the prophetic statement out of chapter 4. Most of the whole chapter is prophetic, where it says that as soon as Alexander dies, his kingdom's not going to go to his descendants, his posterity. It's not going to go, it's going to be divided up among his 4 generals. And so that gave us a chance, you remember a couple of weeks ago, to look at this map. And so what you see is the green area, that's Palestine. That's where God's people are going to go back to. Literally, they are in the process, as all this begins, of going back to Jerusalem, the homeland. They're going back. But they are sandwiched in between Egypt on the bottom and Syria on the top. Syria wasn't known as Syria at that time. It was the Seleucids on top and the Ptolemies on bottom. And so they were kind of sandwiched in between there. And so you'll remember this slide. This is what we ended on 2 weeks ago. You have the Ptolemies in Egypt. You have the Seleucids in the north. And then you have the Israel in the middle. And from this point on now, until the Roman Empire comes along, or really what's called the Roman Republic, to be honest about it. The empire came along later, the Roman Republic. This is the time frame that we're talking about in chapter 11. As we begin to wrap up 11 and exit into 12, we broaden that. We get into what happens when the Lord is on the earth, when He comes back and does His work. And then you get into the AD 70 business, the destruction of Jerusalem, and then you have the concepts that we have all through the Revelation about Jesus' side wins. And so he kind of goes that direction. But what's troubling Daniel, what Daniel was having such a difficult time with in chapter 10 and also in 11, is the short-term future. What's going to happen in the next 1, 2, 3, 400 years. That's the part that had Daniel so upset, because it is not a pleasant thing. It is not going to be an easy thing. Now, a couple of other things I want to throw out at you as we look at 11. Since we're not going to take it verse by verse, I don't really want us to do that, because we get so caught up in which Seleucid king are we referring to here? Are we talking about the 4th Syrian war or the 5th? We get into all of that and we miss the point. What I want you to think about is a high-level view of the people who are living during this time. You have people in Egypt. You have people up north of Jerusalem in what we would call Syria, the Seleucid people. There are folks in other parts of the world, but this is what the text is focused on, and the reason it's focused on that is because God's people are the ones involved. Remember, Daniel, well, you tell me, what is the time frame when Daniel begins to ask the question, what's going to happen to our people? What's the time frame? 536. Okay, and what does that mean for Daniel? Why is Daniel even asking the question? 70 years is up. Yeah, time's coming to a close here. The prophecy was 70 years. It's been 70 years, so now what? The now what is what prompts all of this. And if you and I had been a part of captivity for 70 years with different kings and kingdoms in charge, if we'd been part of that, don't you think the idea of going home would be pretty important to us, pretty paramount? That's the thing. What else do you want? You want to go home. God literally told Daniel and his people, serve the king of Babylon. Don't rebel against him, serve him. And they did that. Daniel and his group did that. Daniel's one of those noble guys. He's a good guy. He did that. But he wants to go home. He wants his people to go home. And so then he gets this vision that indicates to him that going home is not going to be all that great. It's nice to go home, but things aren't going to be great at home. There will be moments when it's just wonderful, but for the next few hundred years, God's people are going to suffer. And it's going to be hard. And you could just imagine Daniel's process of, wait a minute, we're here because we were disobedient. We've taken the punishment, if you will. Now, wouldn't we think we could get back to? And the answer is no. No. It has a little bit of Adam and Eve in the garden in it, just a little bit, where what you once had, you will never have again. It cannot be done. And that's a hard thing. Oh, that is a tough thing. Adam and Eve couldn't go back and undo what had been done. And when God gave the promised land to the Hebrews, to the Israelites, He gave them a good land. And the way they treated the land, the way they treated God, the way they behaved in that land was not good at all. And through a period of, again, several hundred years, it devolved, and they were taken away into captivity. And now when they go back, they have to come to terms with, Daniel especially has to come to terms with, it's not going to be like it was. We're not going to go back to that. And that's one of those little side lessons in all of this, that there's a point at which we have tipped the scale and we cannot get back what we had. And that is true whether you were the one driving the bus off the cliff or you were just one who happened to be riding it. It really doesn't matter. The truth is you can't put it back up there, and that's where they are. And so the detail that you have in chapter 11 is really God affirming to Daniel and then subsequently everybody else. This is what's going to take place, and this is of me. I have sanctioned this. This is the way it's going to go. And what happens there is this time period kind of dwindles down because you have, again, Alexander the Great, about 323, isn't that right, about when he dies? About 323. And so from that time on, tremendous battles between the north and the south, the Seleucids and the Ptolemies, but then another player comes on the scene, a big player in the region, that's the Romans. Their little group, their little empire begins to grow. And there's a point at which they take over all of it. If you look in chapter 11, if you have your Bible open in chapter 11, there's a couple of references in chapter 11, especially down in verse 17, that's the one that I want you to consider, where one of the daughters of the king will be given to the king of the north. And what we're trying to arrange there is a truce. We're trying to put together a treaty and make things work. The difficult part of all that is the daughter is like 10 years old when that takes place. But what they're trying to do is arrange control and peace in the region and all of that. Well, she doesn't go for that. She kind of turns on her father who gave her away and all of that. And so peace doesn't happen. The reason I'm telling you all that is because of this. Her name was Cleopatra. She was number one. She was Cleopatra 1. She was from Egypt, obviously. She was the first one. And so all the way through the seventh one, which you are aware of, Cleopatra, Mark Antony, Octavian, all that, you're very aware of that. That's the seventh one, okay? So from the first one mentioned in verse 17 to the seventh one in 30 BC when she dies, all of this is going on between the north and the south with Israel in the middle, and then the Romans come on the scene and they just begin to dominate and take over. Everything fell apart. The last king that really ruled was Antiochus Epiphanes. He was the fourth one. And you see his time frame there on the screen. He was ruler from 175 to 164. It is about the 190 time frame that Cleopatra I is used to try to form a treaty. So in a very short, compressed amount of time, things begin to fall apart. And what you see is this is the last one that really ruled and dominated, and he was just about as bad as they come. And he is the subject, really, of verses 20 through 45, really. And you could go right on into 1, 2, and 3 of chapter 12. He is the subject of, he made it terrible for God's people. He put God's people in a terrible spot. And all of that's going to come to a head but Jesus is going to come. And when Jesus comes, true or false, everything just automatically gets better. True? Not really. Not really. Wouldn't you think when your Messiah comes, everything's going to get better? We say from time to time Christianity is an upside-down kingdom. What we mean by that is the servant is the one who's on top. Really, the one who serves is greatest in the kingdom. Well, one of the reasons also we say it's an upside-down kingdom is because what you would naturally think would happen isn't what always happens. When Jesus comes, we think everything's going to get better. Everything's just going to be fine. But then we understand that Satan's work pretty well ramped up when Jesus came. Remember who was it who was angry when a baby had been born and wanted to find the baby? Who was that? Herod, right? He wanted to find the king of the Jews, right? And so he had all the babies killed, all the baby boys killed, right? Because he had to find that king. Herod is one of those people, personalities, that serves as a type of what Satan is also doing at the same time. Satan's doing the same thing, scrambling around, trying to figure out what's going on with the Son of God, the Messiah of God. What was one of the first things that happened to Jesus when he started his public ministry? He was driven by the Spirit in the wilderness to be tempted, right? The battle with Satan was going on. And Jesus dies on the cross victorious, and then just a few years later, what happens in AD 70? Jerusalem's totally destroyed. Just like the land to which Daniel's contemporaries want to go back to. It was totally destroyed. It happened again. That's what I'm after. And so what we have to do in looking at all of that, the important thing is not which king is which and what date did he serve and all that. That's history class. You can do that in history class. That's not the important thing to me in this class. The important thing to me is get a high-level picture of what's going on here so we understand what life's like today. So we have a sense of what God is doing and what that's going to look like. Because I promise you, it won't look like what we think it ought to look like sometimes. Our reasoning is not what God uses to establish how he deals with the kingdoms of men. And we need to get that lesson. When Daniel got it, it frightened him. It was a difficult thing for him. But we need to learn that lesson as well. God's rescue sometimes doesn't look like we think it ought to look. One of the biggest rescues that is just epic and awesome is when the children of Israel leave Egypt, right? I mean, the text, the New American Standard text uses the word plunder. They plundered the Egyptians. You know what that means? They took what they wanted. They rounded up everything they could carry. You can imagine them scrambling around, picking up a whole lot more than they could carry. They plundered them. They took everything they could take, and they headed off to the Promised Land. That's one of those pictures of how God can and will deliver his people. But because sometimes we're difficult and hard-headed and we don't want to be delivered the way he wants to deliver us, our deliverance is different. And sometimes it is a struggle. And sometimes you are delivered from difficulty in the middle of difficulty. And that's what you see here. That's why sometimes it is just so that Christians will serve the Lord and not reap a whole lot of benefit for it in the moment, in any particular circumstance. I have a friend in Houston who is going through some terrible things right now with disease and whatnot, and not anything other folks haven't gone through, even right here. But it's bad. And he's just been one of those faithful, hard-working folks who preaches the gospel. Just good guy. His deliverance, the way the world looks at it, his deliverance isn't much. His reward for having done that work isn't much. But you have to keep your eye on the right prize. That's what this section teaches us. But also it teaches us that God knows what he's doing. I have put together some questions that I want us to discuss. And I want you to help me discuss these questions. And we'll get started on them today. And then what we're going to do, Lord willing, next week and the following week is some of the same stuff, but I want to give you an opportunity to talk. And so if you have some questions or discussion points that you want to bring up in class, let's plan for that next Wednesday and the following Wednesday, if the Lord wills, and we'll go at some things like that. But let's kind of get started first of all, with some really easy, obvious questions. Are any of these kings that are discussed here, are any of them ruling today? Well, that's pretty easy to answer, isn't it? Okay, why would I ask that question? What is the so what of that? What is a point to be made out of that?
Well,
yes, ma'am.
They consider themselves all powerful, and I guess they thought things were going to continue on for themselves.
They were incredibly powerful. I would suggest you and I don't know power like they knew power. They were dominating huge swaths of land. They controlled everything. And they're not here anymore. They're gone. They haven't been here for a long time. What about that? What do you learn from that? What do you do with that? Because you already knew that. What do you do with it? Yeah, go ahead real quick.
I can't help, Todd, but think about Paul's words to the men on Mars Hill in Acts 17 about the business of, times and seasons of kings and kingdoms. That's something that God deals with, and we need to acknowledge that He sets the boundaries.
Okay.
These things, and regardless of my circumstance and how powerful and evil whoever it is that I might be subject to, at some point in time, if God wills it, that guy's going to go away.
Okay.
And I have to learn to deal with the circumstance regardless of who's the guy.
Yeah. Those folks aren't here anymore. Somebody else is, but they're not. Go ahead, David. Yes, sir.
Of all the bad things that he did it at the direction of God. God called him his servant.
Yes, he did. And he came around, it appears, to some degree, and understood more about who God was. The fact that they're not here anymore, though, tells you what about you? We're not going to be here very long. And it doesn't matter whether we're the king of a huge, monstrous empire or whether we're one of the cogs in the wheels of the empire. It just doesn't make any difference. Once this life ends for us, it just doesn't matter anymore. And that's hard because everything we know today matters. It just does. How much gas you got in your car matters because you're probably going to try to go home after this. It just matters to you. But there will come a time when none of that makes any bit of difference to you. And if we forget that, if we lose that, then we're losing the lesson here. God is involved in this process. God knows which of these kings is going to try to sell his daughter to another king for peace. He does not approve of that. That is not what he wants to happen. That is abhorrent to him, but he knows who's going to do that. He knows all about that. And all those people lived for a while and died. That's what they did. And that's exactly what you and I are going to do. And there's no way around that. There's no way out of that. And we need to keep that in mind today, that that's just how it works. And so in conjunction with that, think about God's ability to know the future. I want to talk about why he sometimes allows some of the things he does. But before we do that, characterize for me God's ability to know the future. Describe that. How would you put that in words? Limitless? Omniscience? What does that mean? What do you mean when you say that? God's ability to know the future. Be more specific.
You don't have a time on it.
Okay. All right. God's not operating the way we are about the future. That's a hard one for us to get. When I talk to you about the future, you need to know time frame. How long in the future are we talking about? If I say we're going to take a trip, then one of the first things you're going to ask me, aside from where you're going, is when are you going? We have to have a defined amount of time because that's how we operate. God knows the near future, the distant future. He knows every detail in all of that. I don't fully understand how that can be so. I can't hardly figure out where I'm supposed to go this afternoon. But God knows all of that all the time. And so describing his ability to know the future is actually kind of difficult for us because we can't relate to it. You don't literally know God's ability to know the future. You can go to passages like Psalm 139 where it says God knows you and sees you wherever you are and he knows what you were going to do before you were born, literally. Just like He knows what these kings are going to do before they're born. He knows the treaties they're going to try to make. He knows the failed military campaigns they're going to go on. He knows all of that before they're even on the earth. He knows it. Hard for us to describe that. It's really hard for us to make good use of that knowledge other than to just recognize that's who He is and we're not like that. But then beyond that, how does He relate to time compared to us? That's a question I want you to think about. How does God relate to time compared to us? I want to answer that one this way, and then you're welcome to comment. The way we deal with time is we deal with it in a very linear fashion, and we deal with it in a very real fashion. So everything we do has dates and times. Whether we say them or not, it does. If I ask you what you did last Thursday, I have already given you time, right? And then you can ask, well, morning or evening. And no matter what we do, there's time. God doesn't operate like that. God, the best way I think about it in my mind is like this. God operates based on circumstances. What I mean by that is God acts, does something when the circumstances are appropriate for Him to do something. You remember in Genesis chapter 15, there's that statement we always refer back to where God says, the iniquity of the Amorites is not yet what? It's not yet full, not yet complete. What does that mean? Just, David, since you spoke up, what does that mean? What's the statement saying?
They haven't come to that place yet.
Okay, they haven't arrived there. It's not time yet, right? But God doesn't think in terms of time. He doesn't operate in terms of time. He operates in terms of the circumstances. So He says they haven't gotten to the point yet where I'm going to deal with them. It is very similar to what we saw with Nebuchadnezzar. When you get to the point where you acknowledge that I am the Lord, then you can stop living like a wild animal. When you get to that point, how much time is that? Doesn't matter to God. That's not the focus. God deals with circumstances and situations, not time on a clock. And so when He's talking about chapter 11, when He's talking about the vision that Daniel had, sometimes it skips around a little bit. Sometimes it's out of what we would consider chronological order. Doesn't matter to God. He's looking at circumstances. As this country does this, as these people choose this, as all these events take place, here's the way I'm going to respond to that. And the more we think about God that way, the more accurate picture we have of Him. And listen, here's the point of all that. The less important time actually becomes to us. Because there is one measurement of time that everybody keeps in their mind, and that is, I'm going to live a certain amount of time. I'm going to exist on earth a certain amount of time. And we even say, and I have literally said myself, I wanted more time with someone. That's how we think. We want the time. I get that. I literally know that. I feel that. But what if we thought about it more like God does? And what we really want are circumstances to eventuate, circumstances to occur. We want the people we love to be faithful to God. We want the people we love to be in a right relationship with God. It's not a time concern as much as it is a circumstance concern. In other words, we care about the same thing God cares about. God doesn't care about what day it is for me. He cares about, am I going to be faithful today? That's the question, is will you be faithful today? Not, is it Saturday or is it Wednesday? If we thought more like He does about things, maybe circumstances would become the prominent thing instead of how long am I going to live? How long am I going to be sick? How long am I going to have to recover from surgery? How long am I have to deal with this? Circumstances. Are we where we're supposed to be? Are we constructing the life we should construct with whatever time we have? And that might be helpful for us. But quick question, why does God allow us to suffer like He does? Why does He, if He knows that all these 6 Syrian wars are going to take place, and then He knows that from about 160 or so BC, right up until 30 BC, God's people are just going to be put through the ringer, and it's going to be terrible. And then the Romans are going to show up and dominate them after that, because the Roman Empire literally takes off in 30 AD when Pompey begins to run the show. He puts the empire together, and then things go from there. Well, if God knows all of that, and He does, and if He sees all of that, and He does, then why is that happening? It's that question that, you and I would never say it like this, but why would a good God allow so much bad? You would never say that. I didn't say that. I'm not saying that. But people ask that question. Why would a good God allow so much bad? And I'll let you comment on that just real quick. Don't do a long one because we don't have time. Real quick. Why?
Part of it's that refining process that Paul talks about, 1 Corinthians 3, that tested by fire business.
Okay, the refining process Dr. Bailey mentioned in 1 Corinthians 3 is in Daniel chapter 11. Beginning in verse 32, that little paragraph, he says there's going to be some who are trying to do right, and they're going to suffer, and it's going to be hard for them. There's going to be some who are living under the umbrella of doing right, but they're not sincere about it, and it's going to destroy them. And so it will refine. The idea is it's going to sort them all out. That's one of the things that takes place. That's good. What else? Miranda, did you have?
All three, like in the study of history, you have your basic, here's when it happened, here's what happened, here's your main players.
Mm-hmm.
But those who are, study history in a deeper manner, you don't see history in those terms. You see history as these people who are nobody. This is how that they grew from what they experienced. This is what they dealt with. This is how they move forward. And if we didn't have that, the ability to look back to those times and see how people dealt in moments of true struggle, what's the point? What there is no point in the idea of God if we don't. I don't know if I'm making sense, but if there's no growth, then those things are what cause growth.
Why do we have the Old Testament? It's a tutor to bring us to Christ. It's history that shows us God, God's people, nature, characterizations of people, and it teaches us. Do we learn well from it, generally speaking? Do we learn well from it as a group of humanity? Do we learn well from it? No. Have we ever? Do we learn well from recent history in the United States? No. Are you trying to learn well history so you can? Yeah, you are. Any other comments about why? Yes, ma'am.
It makes us realize that this world is not our home.
Okay. Very good. Very good. Very good. This is never going to be the place you want to be. Listen, the more you think about this place, and sometimes we miss that because our lives, I won't speak for you, my life has been just so easy, it's ridiculous. I've told you before, virtually every problem I've ever had in life I caused. So that's just the way that is. But the truth of the matter is, the more we understand this place compared to the place God has prepared for us, the less time we want to spend here. And you have seen, and I have seen people who will look you in the eye and say, I'm ready to go. I've had all this I need. I'm ready to go. And man, sometimes that's hard for us. And then we turn around and go, that's the best thing I've ever heard. That is exactly the kind of attitude I want to have. That I've had all of this I can take. Even as good as it is, even the best steak you can imagine with the air conditioner turned really down low so it's cool in the house, even the best situation you can come up with, and that's about paradise from where I'm concerned on earth. That's nothing. And so we've got to get there. But this helps us see that this world is just brute force ugly. That takes me to the last one I want to get in on the screen real quick because I want to end with the point. And the question is imperial ambition ever good for its subjects? Is the empire mentality and the growing the empire and all that, does it ever really serve the subjects? There may be a couple of exceptions, and there are always some in a kingdom who are well taken care of, but generally speaking, the subjects, the average person is not served well by the imperial ambition that you see all throughout history and now. It never is served well. And the reason I want to make that point in the last couple of minutes of class is because I want you to contrast what you've seen throughout history over and over and over with this kingdom and that kingdom and the next kingdom. And even today, I want you to contrast that with God's kingdom, which is literally designed to serve its subjects. One of the things that is so remarkable about that is it doesn't matter whether you're talking about Antiochus the Fourth, who was just really great and powerful, or Darius the Mede, or Cyrus the Persian, or Alexander the Great, or Nebuchadnezzar, or Nabopolassar or any of the other guys. It doesn't matter who you're talking about. God is infinitely more powerful than they. So much so that, there's no comparison. And yet everything he has done in his kingdom is designed for the benefit of his subjects. It is truly an upside-down kingdom. It is unlike anything. And so when we compare the things on this earth with the things of God's kingdom, we're not understanding the nature of the kingdom. We're just missing it. And that's why Jesus, when he came and started preaching, when he was on earth preaching, how many times did he say, the kingdom of heaven is like? He's saying you need to get a new perspective. You need to get a new lens through which to look, because the current normal lens won't work. You won't see it. And I want us to get that what Daniel has seen here is these people are going to oppress their subjects and God's people. It's going to happen over and over and over again. And just the time you think it's going to stop, it's going to get even worse. And when Jesus comes, you think it's really going to be great. It's going to be even worse until you're basically just destroyed. And Jews cease to exist. One of the reasons they cease to exist, technically, is because all the records that prove they were Jews don't exist anymore. And so they don't exist anymore. They literally, in that sense, were wiped out. But the kingdom of God came in all that process. And it's okay. It's absolutely okay. We say this often. I try to say it enough to bother you, but not enough to make you really sick about it. Stop worrying about what's going to happen in the United States of America. And I know the first thing you'll say in return is, what about my grandchildren and their grandchildren and my great-grandchildren? I understand all that. Do you not think God can handle that? Do you not believe God already has thought of that? Whatever it is I came up with, God's already come up with that. This sort of thing happens. And our task is to be in His kingdom, serving Him as King, being His subject, because that's really where it's at, and that's what's designed for you in the first place. Stop worrying about what's going to happen here. You're not going to fix it anyway. Focus on His kingdom. Go back to Daniel 2. That's the one that endures forever. That's it. And it is literally designed for you, to make you okay. It's kind of unique. Yes, sir. Go ahead.
Kind of the same thing as when our Lord told some of his disciples that they didn't understand that kind of spirit they are of.
Yes, sir. That's it. Sometimes we think like the world, and I don't mean like people of the world. I mean we think like natural, earthly, as Paul would say in 1 Corinthians chapter 2, people. And we need to be thinking like subjects of the King. That's just what we need to be doing. And things change and they simplify, and you don't worry about what you used to worry about, and time becomes a different thing for you. It becomes opportunity. And don't misunderstand me. I'm not there yet. But that's the objective. Thank you.